Hi folks, you're with Tastas today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. And in this live stream chat, I'd like to talk about the issue of sending Western jobs and Western employment prospects and the future employment prospects of Western workers, of sending those jobs overseas. They could be manufacturing jobs or IT jobs or any sort of job. It doesn't matter, but sending them offshore, particularly to third world countries, populous third world countries. Now, just an example, Ford and General Motors closed down in Australia and opened around the same time, opened up a little bit earlier, opened up factories. In fact, I think between them 4 or 5 factories in India, and they had high hopes. The Indian economy was going to really kick ahead. There was going to be huge growth, and the opportunities were going to be massive. And these so-called hard-headed businessmen made this call, and this is equivalent, of course, sending Western jobs offshore. So they opened up the factories there and set up distributor networks and sales and marketing teams and the whole business. Now, I don't know what sort of numbers and sets of numbers they were looking at, these big companies, whether it be Ford or General Motors or any other, but they're both closing down in India now, racking up billions of dollars of losses in a fairly short space of time. And so unsuccessful were they, and so great were the losses that they haven't even stuck it out for a couple of decades. They've pretty much given up almost straight away, if you look at it in terms of international moving around of capital and jobs and labour and people and so on. So just to give you an idea of, we'll use India as a case in point here, but it could apply to other third world countries. India has a population of just shy of 1.4 billion. That's billion with a B. So they're only a few 100,000 short of being the most populous nation in the world next to China. So almost 1.4 billion people. Now, Australia has a population of 25 million. But to give you an idea just how poor India is, the Indian economy is just slightly over double the size of the Australian economy, just slightly over double the size. Now, let me just come out with those numbers again. 25 million population Australia and 1.4 billion people in India, yet their economy is just slightly over double the size of Australia's. That just illustrates how poor the country is. Now, in terms of motor vehicle consumption, only 1 in 5 Indians owns a motor vehicle, and something like 80% of those vehicles are motorbikes, or as the Indians call them, two-wheel vehicles. And the majority of the cars that are driven, this is not by the very rich, of course, the majority of cars that are driven are 900cc little buzz boxes, something that we would consider just a little inner city buzz box in the West. So that's the sort of the motor vehicle consumption in India, and they're looking at, say, on a good year, and I think 2020 is the numbers I'm looking at here. They're going to sell a little bit over 20 million, or did sell a little bit over 20 million vehicles, and again that includes two-wheel motorcycles. So we're talking about a very small market. It's smaller than the Australian motor vehicle market by quite a bit. So it's hardly surprising that Ford and General Motors weren't successful there. Now, the only really successful car selling company in India is Suzuki, and they did a joint venture on buying into the government controlled motor vehicle car manufacturing monopoly that the Indian government owned at the time, and Suzuki bought a share in it. I think they've got a majority share in it now, and there've been some interesting human or public relations, industrial relations issues there. There were some riots in the factory where the employees went wild and actually murdered, as I understand it, the HR manager. Maybe that's something for the West to consider, given some of the HR departments here. But anyway, it's obviously an interesting place in terms of simmering tensions at all levels. So, and that reflected that thing. But look, the situation is that India's growth in wealth has been painfully slow. And in spite of all Western investment, sending jobs, millions of Indian workers leaving India to go and work in the West, in IT and other employment, sending their money back. In spite of all these sorts of things, the Indian economy is growing at a snail's pace, and appears to no matter how much money there's or wealth that is produced, it disproportionately gravitates to the richest 0.1%. The Brahmin caste who order the economy to their own benefit. But this gives an illustration as to how foolhardy and how counterproductive, if not destructive, it is to send Western jobs and Western manufacturing, Western technology over to these third world countries. They're not going to become wealthy countries in their own right. They will rely completely on Western technology, Western assistance, Western loans, and so on. They rely completely on that to achieve anything at all. And the minute that the West packs up and leaves, they'll go back to where they were before. So the issue here is if you're going to build up an economy such as India or China or any of the populous economy, it's going to take over 100 years or up to 100 years to achieve it. So if you're taking wealth away from the West and moving it to these economies, then it's got to be 100-year or very, very long-term project. And the West is going to have to reduce its wealth and consumption and all these things to about the same level as the target country, say India in this case. So if the entire Western economy, United States included, Western Europe, Britain, all reduced their wealth considerably and then transferred all that wealth to India, then you would find some sort of equilibrium. But otherwise, it's just something that's not going to work. The West is sending their jobs offshore and achieving nothing and getting nothing in return. In the case of China, there have been some successes, but only because the government has an iron control of the labour force and effectively forces people to work for shit money and to do all sorts of jobs, long shifts, living in tiny dormitories, bringing before people to a tiny dormitory and so on. So this is how the Chinese are achieving it through fixing and rigging, if you like, the labour market in China. But all that's done. It's not to create consumption for Western goods, although that does happen. The issue is that China's now become a major rival to the West and wants to reorder the world to suit itself. So that's really achieved nothing either. So the solution has to be to building world wealth is to keep the wealth in the West, keep the expertise, keep the manufacturing there, and then try and build slowly and gradually and manage maybe small zones in these places and gradually build on those and then create wealth that way. It's a longer term project. But instead of making the West poor and getting nothing in return for it, might as well be managed properly so that all benefit. These countries are already basket cases. So if it takes a bit longer to move them out of that situation, then fine. But at least the rest of the world isn't being punished for what these foolhardy adventures are. And just looking at the complete non-success of Ford and General Motors in India, then we can see just how that's panning out. That's my take on things, and you've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.